Great Expectations is the 13th novel by Charles Dickens and his penultimate completed novel, a bildungsroman which depicts the personal growth and personal development of an orphan nicknamed Pip. It is Dickens's second novel after David Copperfield to be fully narrated in the first person. The novel was first published as a serial in Dickens's weekly periodical All the Year Round, from the 1st of December 1860 to August 1861. In October 1861, Chapman and Hall published the novel in 3 volumes. The novel is set in Kent and London in the early to mid-19th century and contains some of Dickens' most memorable scenes, including the opening in a graveyard, where the young Pip is accosted by the escaped convict, Abel Magwitch. Great Expectations is full of extreme imagery, poverty, prison ships in chains, and fights to the death, and has a colorful cast of characters who have entered popular culture. These include the eccentric Miss Havisham, the beautiful but cold Estella, and Joe, the unsophisticated and kind blacksmith. Dickens's themes include wealth and poverty, love and rejection, and the eventual triumph of good over evil. Great Expectations has been translated into many languages and adapted numerous times into various media. Upon its release, the novel received near universal acclaim, although Thomas Carlyle spoke disparagingly of all that Pip's nonsense. Later, George Bernard Shaw praised the novel as all of one piece and consistently truthful. During the serial publication, Dickens was pleased with public response to Great Expectations and its sales. When the plot first formed in his mind, he called it a very fine, new and grotesque idea. Plot summary. On Christmas Eve, around 1812, Pip, an orphan who was about 7 years old, encounters an escaped convict in the village churchyard while visiting the graves of his mother Georgiana, father Philip, Pirip and siblings. The convict scares Pip into stealing food and a file to grind away his shackles. For the home he shares with his abusive elder sister and her kind husband Joe Gargery, a blacksmith. The next day, soldiers recapture the convict while he is engaged in a fight with another escaped convict. The two are returned to the prison ships. Miss Havisham, a wealthy spinster who wears an old wedding dress and lives in the dilapidated Satyr's house, asks Pip's uncle Pumblechook to find a boy to visit. Pip visits Miss Havisham and her adopted daughter Estella, falling in love with Estella on first sight, both quite young. Pip visits Miss Havisham regularly until it comes time for him to learn a trade. Joe accompanies Pip for the last visit when she gives the money for Pip to be bound as apprentice blacksmith. Pip settles into learning Joe's trade. When both are away from the house, Mrs. Joe is brutally attacked, leaving her unable to speak at her work. Goody arrives to help with her care and becomes a blessing to the household. 4 years into Pip's apprenticeship, Mr. Jaggers, a lawyer, approaches him in the village with the news that he has expectations from an anonymous benefactor, with immediate funds to train him in the gentlemanly arts. He will not know the benefactor's name until the person speaks up. Pip is to leave for London in the proper clothes. He assumes that Miss Havisham is his benefactor. He visits her to say goodbye. Pip sets up house with Herbert Pocket at Barnard's Inn. Herbert tells Pip the circumstances of Miss Havisham's romantic disappointment, her jilting by her fiancé. Pip goes to Hammersmith to be educated by Mr. Matthew Pocket, Herbert's father. Jaggers disperses the money Pip needs to set himself up in his new life. Joe visits Pip at Barnard's Inn, where Pip is a bit ashamed of Joe. Joe relays the message from Miss Havisham that Estella will be at Satyr's house for a visit. Pip and Herbert exchange the romantic secrets. Pip adores Estella and Herbert is engaged to Clara. Pip and Pip.It build up debts. Mrs. Joe dies and Pip returns to his village for the funeral. Pip's income is fixed at £500 per annum when he comes of age at 21. Pip takes Estella to Satter's house. She and Miss Havisham quarrel. At the assembly ball in Richmond, Estella meets Bentley Drumler, a brute of a man. A week after he turns 23 years old, Pip learns that his benefactor is the convict from so long ago, Abel Magwitch, who had been transported to New South Wales after that escape. He became wealthy after gaining his freedom there. As long as he is out of England, Magwitch can live. But he returns to see Pip. Pip was his motivation for all his success in New South Wales. Pip is shocked, ceasing to take money from him. He and Pip.It devise a plan to get Magwitch out of England by boat. Magwitch shares his past history with Pip. Pip tells Miss Havisham that he is as unhappy as she can ever have meant him to be. He asks her to finance her Pip.It. Estella tells Pip she will marry Bentley Drumler. Miss Havisham tells Pip that Estella was brought to her by Jaggers age 2 or 3. Before Pip leaves the property, Miss Havisham accidentally sets her dress on fire. Pip saves her, injuring himself in the process. She eventually dies from her injuries, lamenting her manipulation of Estella and Pip. Jaggers tells Pip how he brought Estella to Miss Havisham from Molly. Pip figures out that Estella is the daughter of Molly and Magwitch. A few days before the escape, Joe's former journeyman Orlick seizes Pip, confessing past crimes as he means to kill Pip. Pip.It and Startup save Pip and prepare for the escape. On the river, they are met by a police boat carrying Compeyson for identification of Magwitch. Compeyson was the other convict years earlier, and as well, the con artist who wooed and deserted Miss Havisham. Magwitch seizes Compeyson, and they fight in the river. Magwitch survives to be taken by police, seriously injured. Compeyson's body is found later. Pip visits Magwitch in jail and tells him that his daughter Estella is alive. Magwitch responds by squeezing Pip's palm and dies soon after, sparing an execution. After Herbert goes to Cairo, Pip falls ill in his rooms. He is confronted with arrest for debt. He awakens to find Joe at his side. Joe nurses Pip back to health and pays off the debt. As Pip begins to walk about on his own, Joe slips away home. Pip returns to propose to Biddy, to find that she and Joe have just married. Pip asks Joe for forgiveness, and Joe forgives him. As Magwitch's fortune in money and land was seized by the court, Pip no longer has income. Pip promises to repay Joe. Herbert asks him to join his firm in Cairo. He shares lodgings with Herbert and Clara and works as a clerk, advancing over time. 11 years later, Pip visits the ruins of Satter's house and meets Estella, widow to the abusive Bentley Drumler. She asks Pip to forgive her, assuring him that misfortune has opened her heart and that she now empathizes with Pip. As Pip takes Estella's hand and leaves the ruins of Satter's house, he sees no shadow of another parting from her. Characters: Pip and his family. Philip Pirrip, nicknamed Pip, an orphan and the protagonist and narrator of Great Expectations. In his childhood, Pip dreamed of becoming a blacksmith like his kind brother-in-law, Joe Gargery. At Satter's house, about age 8, he meets Estella, a contact which destroys his peace of mind. He tells Biddy that he wants to become a gentleman. As a result of Magwitch's anonymous patronage, Pip lives in London and becomes a gentleman. Pip assumes his benefactor is Miss Havisham. The discovery that his true benefactor is a convict shocks him. Joe Gargery, Pip's brother-in-law, and his first father figure. He is a blacksmith who is always kind to Pip and the only person with whom Pip is always honest. Joe is disappointed when Pip decides to leave his home to live in London to become a gentleman rather than be a blacksmith in business with Joe. He is a strong man who bears the shortcomings of those closest to him. Mrs. Joe Gargery, Pip's hot-tempered adult sister Georgiana Maria, called Mrs. Joe, 20 years older than Pip. She brings him up after their parents' death. She does the work of the household, but too often loses her temper. Orlick, her husband's journeyman, attacks her, and she is left disabled until her death. Mr. Pumblechook, Joe Gargery's uncle, an officious bachelor and corn merchant. While not knowing how to deal with a growing boy, he tells Mrs. Joe, as she is known, how noble she is to bring up Pip. As the person who first connected Pip to Miss Havisham, he claims to have been the original architect of Pip's expectations. Pip dislikes Mr. Pumblechook for his pompous, unfounded claims. When Pip stands up to him in a public place after those expectations are dashed, Mr. Pumblechook turns those listening to the conversation against Pip. Miss Havisham and her family. Miss Havisham, a wealthy spinster who takes Pip on as a companion for herself and her adopted daughter, Estella. Havisham is a wealthy, eccentric woman who has worn her wedding dress and one shoe since the day that she was jilted at the altar by her fiancé. Her house is unchanged as well. She hates all men, and plots to wreak a twisted revenge by teaching Estella to torment and spurn men, including Pip, who loves her. Miss Havisham is later overcome with remorse for ruining both Estella's and Pip's chances for happiness. Shortly after confessing her plotting to Pip, she dies as the result of being badly burned when her dress accidentally catches fire. Estella, Miss Havisham's adopted daughter, whom Pip pursues. She is a beautiful girl, and grows more beautiful after her schooling in France. Estella represents the life of wealth and culture for which Pip strives. Since Miss Havisham ruined Estella's ability to love, Estella cannot return Pip's passion. She warns Pip of this repeatedly, but he will not or cannot believe her. Estella does not know that she is the daughter of Molly, Jaggers's housekeeper, and the convict Abel Magwitch, given up for adoption to Miss Havisham after her mother was arrested for murder. Matthew Pocket, Miss Havisham's cousin. He is the patriarch of the Pocket family, but unlike her other relatives, he is not greedy for Havisham's wealth. Matthew Pocket tutors young gentlemen, such as Bentley Drumler, Startop Pip and his own son Herbert. Herbert Pocket, the son of Matthew Pocket, who was invited like Pip to visit Miss Havisham, but she did not take to him. Pip first meets Herbert as a pale young gentleman, who challenges Pip to a fist fight at Miss Havisham's house when both are children. He later becomes Pip's friend, tutoring him in the gentlemanly arts, and sharing his flat with Pip in London. Cousin Raymond, a relative of Miss Havisham who is only interested in her money. He is married to Camilla. Georgiana, a relative of Miss Havisham who is only interested in her money. She is one of the many relatives who hang around Miss Havisham like flies for her wealth. Sarah Pocket, the sister of Matthew Pocket, relative of Miss Havisham. She is often at Satter's house. She is described as a dry, brown, corrugated old woman, with a small face that might have been made out of walnut shells, and a large mouth like a cat's without the whiskers. From Pip's youth, the convict, who escapes from a prison ship, whom Pip treats kindly, and who in turn becomes Pip's benefactor. His name is Abel Magwitch, but he uses the aliases Provis and Mr. Campbell when he returns to England from exile in Australia. He is a lesser actor in Crime with Compison, but gains a longer sentence in an apparent application of justice by social class. Mr. and Mrs. Hubble, simple folk who think they are more important than they really are. They live in Pip's village. Mr. Wopsle, clerk of the church in Pip's village. He later gives up the church work and moves to London to pursue his ambition to be an actor, adopting the stage name Mr. Walden Garver. He sees the other convict in the audience of one of his performances, attended also by Pip. Biddy, Wopsle's second cousin and near Pip's age, she teaches in the evening school at her mother's home in Pip's village. Pip wants to learn more, so he asks her to teach him all she can. After helping Mrs. Jo. After the attack, Biddy opens her own school. Her kind and intelligent but poor young woman, she is, like Pip and Estella, an orphan. She acts as Estella's foil. Ulrich was attracted to her, but she did not want his attentions. Pip ignores her affections for him as he pursues Estella. Recovering from his own illness after the failed attempt to get Magwitch out of England, Pip returns to claim Biddy as his bride, arriving in the village just after she marries Joe Gargery. Biddy and Joe later have 2 children, one named after Pip. Mr. Jaggers and his circle. Mr. Jaggers, prominent London lawyer who represents the interests of diverse clients, both criminal and civil. He represents Pip's benefactor and Miss Havisham as well. By the end of the story, his law practice links many of the characters. John Wemmick, Jaggers' clerk, who is Pip's chief go-between with Jaggers and looks after Pip in London. Wemmick lives with his father, the aged parent, in a small replica of a castle, complete with a drawbridge and moat, in Walworth. Molly, Mr. Jaggers' maidservant whom Jaggers saved from the gallows for murder. She is revealed to be Magwitch's estranged wife and Estella's mother. Antagonists: Compeyson, a convict who escapes the prison ship after Magwitch, who beats him up ashore. He is Magwitch's enemy. In some editions of the book, he is called Compey, a professional swindler. He was engaged to marry Miss Havisham, but he was in league with Arthur Havisham to defraud Miss Havisham of part of her fortune. Later he sets up Magwitch to take the fall for another swindle. He works with the police when he learns Abel Magwitch is in London, fearing Magwitch after the first escapes years earlier. When the police boat encounters the one carrying Magwitch, the two grapple and Compeyson drowns in the Thames. Arthur Havisham, younger half-brother of Miss Havisham, who plots with Compeyson to swindle her. Jorlick, journeyman blacksmith at Joe Gargery's forge. Strong, rude and sullen, he is as churlish as Joe is gentle and kind. He ends up in a fist fight with Joe over Mrs. Gargery's taunting, and Joe easily defeats him. This sets in motion an escalating chain of events that leads him to secretly injure Mrs. Gargery and try to kill Pip. The police ultimately arrest him for housebreaking locally. Bentley Drumler, a coarse, unintelligent young man from a wealthy noble family. Pip meets him at Mr. Pocket's house, as Drumler is also to be trained in gentlemanly skills. Drumler is hostile to Pip and everyone else. He is a rival for Estella's attentions and eventually marries her and is said to abuse her. He dies from an accident following his mistreatment of a horse. Other characters: Clara Barley, a very poor girl living with her gout-ridden father. She marries Herbert Pocket near the novel's end. She dislikes Pip at first because of his spendthrift ways. After she marries Herbert, they invite Pip to live with them. Miss Skiffins occasionally visits Wemmick's house and wears green gloves. She changes those green gloves for white ones when she marries Wemmick. Startop, like Bentley Drumler, is Pip's fellow student, but unlike Drumler, he is kind. He assists Pip and Herbert in their efforts to help Magwitch escape. Development history. As Dickens began writing Great Expectations, he undertook a series of hugely popular and remunerative reading tours. His domestic life had, however, disintegrated in the late 1850s, and he had separated from his wife, Catherine Dickens, and was having a secret affair with the much younger Ellen Ternan. The introduction of the 1984 Penguin English Library edition suggests that the reluctance with which Ellen Ternan became his mistress is reflected in the icy teasing of Estella in Great Expectations. Beginning in his Book of Memoranda, begun in 1855, Dickens read names for possible characters: Magwitch, Provis, Clarica, Compey, Pumblechook, Orlick, Gargery, Wopsle, Skiffins, some of which became familiar in Great Expectations. There is also a reference to 2. A knowing man, a possible sketch of Bentley Drummer. Another evokes a house full of toadies and humbugs, foreshadowing the visitors to Sutter's house in Chapter 11. Margaret Cardwell discovered the premonition of great expectations from the 25th of September, 1855 letter from Dickens to W. H. Wills, in which Dickens speaks of recycling an odd idea from the Christmas special A House to Let, and the pivot round which my next book shall revolve. The odd idea concerns an individual who retires to an old lonely house, resolved to shut out the world and hold no communion with it. In an 8th of August 1860 letter to Earl Carlyle, Dickens reported his agitation whenever he prepared a new book. A month later, in a letter to John Forster, Dickens announced that he just had a new idea. Publication in All the Year Round. Dickens was pleased with the idea, calling it such a very fine, new and grotesque idea. In a letter to Forster, he planned to write a little piece, a grotesque tragicomic conception, about a young hero who befriends an escaped convict, who then makes a fortune in Australia and anonymously bequeaths his property to the hero. In the end, the hero loses the money because it is forfeited to the Crown. In his biography of Dickens, Forster wrote that in the early idea was the germ of Pip and Magwitch, which at first he intended to make the groundwork of a tale in the old 20-number form. Dickens presented the relationship between Pip and Magwitch pivotal to Great Expectations, but without Miss Havisham, Estella, or other characters he later created. As the idea and Dickens's ambition grew, he began writing. However, in September, the weekly All the Year Round saw its sales fall, and its flagship publication, A Day's Ride by Charles Lever, lost favor with the public. Dickens called a council of war, and believed that to save the situation, the one thing to be done was to strike in. The very fine, new and grotesque idea became the magazine's new support. Weeklies, 500 pages, just over 1 year, 36 episodes. Starting the 1st of December, the magazine continued to publish Lever's novel until its completion on the 23rd of March 1861, but it became secondary to Great Expectations. Immediately, sales resumed, and critics responded positively, as exemplified by the Times' praise. Great Expectations is not, indeed, best work, but it is to be ranked among his happiest. Dickens, whose health was not the best, felt the planning from week to week was unimaginably difficult, but persevered. He thought he had found a good name, decided to use the first person throughout, and thought the beginning was excessively droll. I have put a child and a good-natured foolish man in relations that seem to me very funny. 4 weekly episodes were ground off the wheel in October 1860, and apart from one reference to the bondage of his heavy task, the months passed without the anguished cries that usually accompanied the writing of his novels. He did not even use the number plans or memes. He only had a few notes on the characters' ages, the tide ranges for Chapter 54, and the draft of an ending. In late December, Dickens read to Mary Boyle that Great Expectations of very great success and universally liked. Dickens gave 6 readings from the 14th of March to the 18th of April 1861, and in May, Dickens took a few days' holiday in Dover. On the eve of his departure, he took some friends and family members for a trip by boat from Blackwall to Southend-on-Sea, ostensibly for pleasure. The mini-cruise was actually a working session for Dickens to examine banks of the river in preparation for the chapter devoted to Magwitch's attempt to escape. Dickens then revised Herbert Pocket's appearance, no doubt, asserts Margaret Cardwell, to look more like his son Charlie. On the 11th of June 1861, Dickens read to Macready that Great Expectations had been completed, and on the 15th of June, asked the editor to prepare the novel for publication. revised ending. Following comments by Edward Bulwer-Lytton that the ending was too sad, Dickens rewrote it. The ending set aside by Dickens has Pip, still single, briefly see Estella in London. After becoming Bentley Drumler's widow, she has remarried. It appealed to Dickens due to its originality, winding up or be away from all such things as they conventionally go. Dickens revised the ending for publication so that Pip meets Estella in the ruins of Satter's house, she a widow and he single. His changes at the conclusion of the novel did not quite end either with the final weekly part and the first bound edition, because Dickens further changed the last sentence in the amended 1868 version from "I could see the shadow of no parting from her" to "I saw no shadow of another parting from her." As Pip uses litotes, no shadow of another parting, it is ambiguous whether Pip and Estella marry or Pip remains single. Angus Calder, writing for an edition in the Penguin English Library, believed the less definite phrasing of the amended 1868 version perhaps hinted at a buried meaning. Single quote. At this happy moment, I did not see the shadow of our subsequent parting looming over us. In a letter to Forster, Dickens explained his decision to alter the draft ending. "You will be surprised to hear that I have changed the end of Great Expectations from an after Pip's return to Joe's. Bulwer, who has been, as I think you know, extraordinarily taken with the book, strongly urged it upon me, after reading the proofs, and supported his views with such good reasons that I have resolved to make the change. I have put in as pretty a little piece of writing as I could, and I have no doubt the story will be more acceptable through the alteration." This discussion between Dickens, Bulwer-Lytton and Forster has provided the basis for much discussion on Dickens's underlying views for this famous novel. Earl Davis, in his 1963 study of Dickens, wrote that it would be an inadequate moral point to deny Pip any reward after he had shown a growth of character, and that 11 years might change Estella too. John Forster felt that the original ending was more consistent and more natural, but noted the new ending's popularity. George Gissing called that revision a strange thing, indeed, to befall Dickens, and felt that Great Expectations would have been perfect had Dickens not altered the ending in deference to Bulwer-Lytton. In contrast, John Hillis Miller stated that Dickens's personality was so assertive that Bulwer-Lytton had little influence, and welcomed the revision. "The mists of infatuation have cleared away," can be joined. Earl Davis notes that G.B. Shaw published the novel in 1937 for the Limited Editions Club with the first ending, and that the Reinhardt edition of 1979 presents both endings. George Orwell wrote, "Psychologically, the latter part of Great Expectations is about the best thing Dickens ever did," but, like John Forster and several early 20th century writers, including George Bernard Shaw, felt that the original ending was more consistent with the draft, as well as the natural working out of the tale. Modern literary criticism is split over the matter.